All right, it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. Our keynote speaker is Dr. Richard Mouw. He's the former president of Fuller Theological Seminary. Fuller is the world's largest multi-denominational seminary, and he got to serve there for 20 years. During that time, he had untold academic achievements. He also had a prominent role in the public square, and he was labeled as one of the leading evangelicals in the nation for his work. He's written 20 books. One of those is Uncommon Decency, Christian Civility in an Uncivil World. And I think I probably joined Dr. Mouw in waiting for that to become a bestseller. We sure need that one. But he's going to be telling about his work on civility in an uncivil world. He's been working on for 20 years plus, and it only gets more relevant as we go. So with that, we're really pleased to have Dr. Richard Mouw with us.
Well, it's great to see you all. I'm still of a generation that needs to get used to this mode of communication, but I'm just delighted that at least I can be with you virtually in virtual space this morning, and I was so glad I got to hear Heidi and her wonderful ministry. And I just want to talk today about how do we engage in difficult conversations with people with whom we seriously disagree. We are such a polarized, divisive society right now. Thursday morning, I fly to Washington, D.C., and we're going to have a 2-day discussion there of people like David Brooks of the New York Times and Mike Gerson of the Washington Post and a number of other evangelical leaders representing a number of various kinds of ministries and congregations. And this is the topic we're going to talk about. It's a constant topic among us today. We, as Christians, Bible-believing Christians, engage in many angry discussions, serious disagreements in the public square. But we even engage in angry discussions, serious disagreements within our own congregations, within our denominations. And I don't need to list the tough topics that we're arguing a lot about these days, but I would be surprised if there's somebody there who hasn't been in a conversation over a difficult topic with someone with whom you disagreed. I actually got into this in the late 1980s. I'm a philosopher. I'm very interested in political thought and public discourse and all of these kinds of things. And so I was reading people like Aristotle and John Locke and Hegel and people like that on issues of public life from a scholarly perspective. But I was reading a little book by Dr. Martin Marty, the great Lutheran historian, social commentator, professor at the University of Chicago. And there was a line that I came across there that just gripped me, and I decided I needed to get further into this. He said, a lot of people today who are civil don't really have very strong convictions. And a lot of people who have strong convictions aren't very civil. And what we really need is convicted civility. Talking to each other about difficult issues in respectful ways. And you know, that's a biblical idea. 1 Peter 3:15 was a verse that I heard a lot as a kid growing up in the evangelical Christian world, and especially the first part of the verse. Always be ready to give to anyone who asks of you a reason for the hope that lies within you. Stand up for know what you believe. Stand up for the truth. Don't back down. You know, when your high school teacher starts teaching evolution, stand up for the truth. You know, when the fast crowd in high school was inviting you into really bad kinds of things. Stand up for purity and truth and beauty and all the rest. Always be ready to give to anyone who asks of you a reason for the hope that lies within you. You know? And that's very important, obviously. But seldom did they go on to the rest of the verse, but do so with gentleness and respect. And some of the more recent translations actually say with gentleness and reverence, that we are to approach people that we want to talk to about some of the deepest issues of life, and especially as Christians, some of the deepest issues of who we are before the face of God. But we are to do it with gentleness and reverence. And then the question is, how do we do that in these difficult times when the issues run so deep and they're so difficult to talk about? And I really have 5 points today, and that sounds like a long speech, but it won't be. I'll go through these rather quickly. But the first one is that as we enter into conversations with people with whom we disagree, as Christians, I think we often, not always, I mean, there are going to be arguments that have votes coming after them and the like, but it's very important to engage people with a posture of learning, of wanting to learn from them. And there's some theology involved in all of that. I have a very good friend, Bob Lane, who was for many years, the CEO at John Deere International, owning tractors and combines and other kind of farm machinery. And Bob had gone to Wheaton College way back, and he studied with a really good friend of mine, a philosophy professor at Wheaton named Arthur Holmes. And Art Holmes, he had a course with Art, and then later on, Art wrote a book based on what Bob Lane really liked in that course, a little book called All Truth is God's Truth. And Bob Lane says, you know, there's a lot of truth out there beyond the boundaries of the church. And we need to learn from it. And he said, that means so much to me in my work. When I go as the CEO of John Deere, when I go to Pakistan and I meet with Muslim John Deere dealers in Pakistan, I enter into that conversation with the expectation that they have things to teach me. And he said, I always pray before I go in that the Lord will give me a spirit of learning because I can learn from them. And that's a powerful kind of thing. And, you know, it's a biblical idea. One of the best sermons I ever heard was on Jonah in the hold of the ship. And the storm came. You all know the story. The storm came. Jonah was supposed to do the will of God and go to Nineveh, but he got on a ship and went the wrong direction because he didn't want to do what God told him to do. The storm came, and the pagan sailors came to Jonah, and they got in an argument. Whose fault is this? And the pagan sailor says to Jonah, it's your fault. And then Jonah says, no, it's your fault. There's that kind of argument. And the preacher said, if all you knew was that this was an argument between pagan sailors and the prophet of God, the prophet of the true God, you'd surely put all your money on the prophet of the true God. But in this case, the sailors were right and the prophet was wrong. Yeah. And he said, this was one of those cases where the world preached a sermon to the church. Pagans preached a sermon to the prophet of God. And we always need to be open to that learning posture, that we're not just going into these discussions to win arguments, but there may be something in there that we need to learn from. And you know, we learn that in church. And this is my second point. As we gather together as the people of God, we gather together as people who know that we need to be corrected. That we may think we're absolutely right about something, but before the face of God, we learn that we're wrong. You know, my very favorite psalm is Psalm 139. Incidentally, I've got a flight to Washington on Thursday early in the morning, and I will think Psalm 139. It's a great airplane in the morning song. You know, if I take the wings of the morning and I fly to the uttermost parts of the sea, thou art there. If I ascend above or I descend beneath, there too you are present. So remember that when you get on a plane sometime early in the morning. God is everywhere. You know, after a while, the psalmist starts he's complaining about things that are going on around him. And he says to the Lord, Lord, I hate your enemies with a perfect hatred. You know, you and I are on the same side, God. You can count on me. And I have a sense in reading that psalm that he kind of stops and he says to himself, wait a minute. And then the next verse is, Lord, search me and know me and see if there is any wicked way in me and test my thoughts and lead me in the way everlasting. And you know, that's the experience of going to church. Lord, look, test me, check into me. Lord, you know me better than I know myself. See if there is any wicked way in me. And you know, in a powerful sense, there's a need for us to approach other people as Jonah did with the pagan sailors, learning where we might have been wrong. And it's not that we're going to pagans and saying, teach me where I'm wrong, but we're asking the Lord to use voices that may be correcting us, that we can learn from in the light of God's word and what God wants us to see about ourselves. And a third thing is that we enter into these conversations as people who want to tell the truth. I won't get into these details at all, but for 20 years, I have been involved in a very off-the-record, very extensive and intensive dialogue with a group of scholars from the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints, the Mormon community. And there have been 7 of us in the evangelical world and 7 Mormon scholars, and we've really gotten to know each other and love each other, and have had wonderfully frank conversations. We've had arguments, but they've been loving arguments, and it's been an amazing experience. And one of the things that I learned was that in the last 20 years or so, since the beginning of this century, the LDS has taken a whole new, and I can document this with videos of speeches given by Mormon leaders to 15 million Mormons around the world. But there's a new emphasis on the cross of Jesus Christ. And there's just a new book, incidentally, by a Mormon scholar from Brigham Young University called Considering the Cross. His name is John Hilton III. You can, if you don't believe me on this, you can take a look at it. We need to be talking more about what happened on the cross of Jesus Christ, where the payment for sin, and as one of the Mormon apostles put it in a wonderful address, actually, to the global Mormon community, that without the finished work of Jesus Christ on the cross of Calvary, where God did something for us that we could never do for ourselves, without that, we're lost. So there is an emphasis there. Now, you may not say, well, what about all those other things? And those are good questions. But I saw that someone was going to give a talk about Mormonism at a local church, and I decided I'd go and listen. And this was a person who goes around warning people about the evils of Mormonism. And in that speech, he said, Mormons hate the cross of Jesus Christ. They do not honor the cross. They purposely avoid the cross. They hate the cross of Jesus Christ. I went up to him afterward and I thanked him for some of the things that I thought he said that were helpful. I said, by the way, I said, you know, there's a whole new emphasis on the cross. I can give you a couple books if you want to find out about it by Mormon writers. But and he got very angry and he shoved his finger in my face and he said, that's the trouble with you intellectuals. we're in a battle for the truth and we've got to win, and we don't have time for all of these fine distinctions. And as I left, I thought to myself, how can you be in a battle for the truth when you purposely insist that you don't have to tell the truth in order to win the battle for the truth? You know? And that's been a tendency that we have. We want to win arguments, or we enter into discussions with preconceived notions, prejudices about what people really believe. And it's so important to learn how to ask questions. One of the things that we've learned a lot in that dialogue and in some of the other dialogues as well, and I've had with people in the broader public, the people that I disagree with about issues of sexuality and the right to life concerns that we heard such good things about, that very often a lot depends on how we talk to other people. So if you say to somebody you're disagreeing, yeah, but you believe, you know, and they immediately are on the defensive. But what we've learned is, help me to understand that better. Is this the way you would put it? And to be truth tellers is to want to characterize the view of the person you disagree with in such a way that they would agree with the way you put their view. And that takes some work, that takes some listening, you know. Is this the way you, help me understand better? Is this what you are saying? Would you agree with this way of putting it? Because truth telling requires that desire to tell the truth, not to bear false witness against our neighbors. And that's such an important part of it. I was on NPR, National Public Radio, several years ago with a gay activist, and I was representing the traditional view of sexuality and marriage, and he was angrily arguing against my kind of view, and we got into quite a bit of a discussion, and finally I stopped and I said, you know, what I wish is that you and I could talk without our supporters listening to us, and we just close the door and we can learn more about how we got to our views. I would love to ask you for your honest answer to this question. What is it about people like me that scare you so much? And that you can ask me, what is it about me and my partner that are such a threat to how you want your kids to be raised, what kind of society you want to live in? You know? And let me tell you how I got into that. Just recently, I'd been listening to, it was close to the Christmas season, and I was listening to, paying attention to some of the words of the Christmas carols that we were singing. And this wonderful Christmas carol, the hopes and fears of all the years are met in these night. And beneath the ideology and the anger of that guy's discussion, there were hopes and fears. And I needed to learn about them. And I wanted him to know about my own hopes and fears, because my own hopes and fears I can bring to Jesus Christ, because he is the ultimate answer to the hopes and fears of the human condition. And then we need to get beyond well, why did you vote that way? But what were the hopes? What were the fears that were at work in you during the past election? Or in the way in which you're upset with the way your pastor's preaching, or the whole mask issue and the like, to get beyond the categorizing of people in terms of how they voted or what they believe about this issue or that issue. And they begin talking about the hopes and fears, because it opens up the possibility for us to say the hopes and fears of all the years can only be met, can only be answered at the cross of Jesus Christ. But we have to begin with a genuine desire to see, and you know, if we could get more into how we voted in an election, or how we view this very difficult issue of sexuality or immigration or whatever, about the hopes and fears of all the years, we would have a different kind of conversation. And also, and this really gets at the same issue, um, engaging other people in terms of their humanness. I was invited by a church to, we had to fly to get there, to engage in dialogue with a Muslim scholar. And she was very, very articulate. We had obviously disagreements, an evangelical Christian talking to a Muslim scholar. We have our disagreements, and we talked a lot about them and tried to model civil discourse in that congregation. And I think it went really well. We were getting in that. We got in a car, they drove us back to the airport together. And we're sitting together in the back seat. And I said to her, tell me about your family. You know? And she paused and she said, I've got 2 school-age kids. And she said, it's so difficult right now. And she started to cry. She said, Muslim children get bullied in the schoolyard. And every morning when I send my kids off to school, I pray that God will protect them to keep them safe for the day. Well, there was a humanizing of that. We had our disagreements, and we were able to talk about those disagreements. But this was a mother who loved her children and was very concerned. And in many ways, her connection to her Islamic faith had a lot to do with a God who she could pray to. And we could have had hours of good discussion just on the nature of prayer and God's mercy and the fact that Jesus Christ understands what it means to be bullied, that Jesus Christ understands what it means to be betrayed by your friends and to be mocked. And that's a different kind of conversation that we could have on the basis of our shared humanness, that this was a mother who prays on behalf of her children. And just a last point. Theologically, there are issues at stake here. It has to do with the fact that we're created in the image of God. And that there's something that just sitting with that Muslim woman on the way to the airport. I was in the presence. I want to say this clearly. I was in the presence of a child of God, created by God in love. And I believe that God wanted me to give a reason for the hope that lies within me, but also to treat her with gentleness and reverence, to take her hopes and fears seriously. And I'm a Calvinist, so I can say, to tell my own story and to listen to her story and know that the Spirit of God has to do the work of bringing a person to Jesus. But it's so important for us to engage the other. The great G.K. Chesterton once said, it's a terrible thing to worship false gods, but it's also a terrible thing to set up false idols, false demons, and that demonization of human beings who are created in the image of God and treating them as if they were nothing but evil people or nothing but people whose lives are full of falsehood or so many other stereotypes is a dishonoring of God's creation. And I want to say these are difficult times, and I wrote that book back in, I think it was published right around 1990, and on civility, and 18 years later, I was in the office of a good friend of mine, no longer in Congress, Senator Frank Wolf, Congressman Frank Wolf, who was a conservative Republican congressman from Virginia, head of the Appropriations Committee, quite a powerful figure in Congress. And we were, we always got together when I in Washington, I'd go to his office. He liked to talk theology. He was an evangelical Christian. I wanted to talk theology. But this time I walked in the office and he said, I got a question for you. He said, from your perspective in California, how do we look in Congress? This is right around the year, just before the year 2000. So how do we look to you folks out there? I said, you look bad. He said it's even worse than you can imagine. He said we used to be able to talk to each other. And he invoked the memory of Ronald Reagan denouncing Tip O'Neill, the head of the Speaker of the House, Irish Catholic Democratic congressman from Boston, and they'd get at it in public, and then they'd get together for lunch and work out a deal, and it would work. And he said, we can't do that anymore. And so he said, you should rewrite that book you wrote. And I actually did. My publisher had asked me to do that. So and I'm not going to rewrite it again, but I want to say in this year of 2021, it's worse than it was in the year 2000. And we need a lot. I want to say to you folks, give a reason for the hope that lies within you. Stand firm for the truth. But approach other people with gentleness and reverence as precious creations of the God and Father of Jesus Christ.
Amen.
Dr. Mouw, thank you so much for that. We're going to have breakout sessions.